Hello, I am Rosario Nava, the Diagnostics Assessment Specialist for the School Improvement Accountability and Compliance Department at Region 1 Educational Service Center. Today we will be discussing the identification of dyslexia. Our table of contents includes neurological characteristics, common risk factors, screener criteria, pathway for the identification and provision of instruction for students with dyslexia, specific learning disability, areas of evaluation, cognitive processes consistent with dyslexia, dyslexia, the unexpectedness, critical evidence-based components of dyslexia instruction, and delivery of dyslexia intervention. We'll go ahead and begin with the functions of the major areas of the brain. This information is coming from the Essentials of Dyslexia and Intervention book, page 45. The cerebral hemispheres consist of the frontal, partial, temporal, and occipital lobes. The frontal lobe is the most anterior of the cerebral hemisphere. It involves the executive functions such as planning, organizing, problem-solving, selective attention, and also personality. The posterior portion of the lobe consists of the premotor and motor areas called the motor cortex. In addition, the partial lobe is located on the posterior to the frontal lobe at the top of the brain, and it contains the primary sensory cortex. These lobes receive data from the skin via the thalamus that process touch and sensation in information such as heat, cold, and pain. The temporal lobe is located inferiorly below the frontal and partial lobes. Its functions include hearing, speech, perception, and some types of memory. It contains the primary auditory cortex and the hippocampi, which are important for memory functions. The right lobe is mainly involved in visual memory. The left lobe is mainly verbal memory. The occipital lobe, located in the back of the brain, this area processes the visual information and is referred to as the visual cortex. Nerve impulses from the retina travel via the thalamus to the occipital lobe. We're going to go ahead and start off with the neurological characteristics of individuals with dyslexia. And this is coming from the Essentials of Dyslexia Assessment and Intervention, page 50. I'd like to start off by stating that children who are poor readers appear to have a disruption in the part of their brain that involves reading phonetically, according to the sophisticated brain imaging study funded by the National Institute of Children's Health and Human Development. They, in conjunction with Dr. Shaywitz, concluded that dyslexic children brain image is different than those that are not impaired. As you can view this illustration here, it indicates that non-impaired children have 3 domains that they use as their reading. However, a dyslexic child focuses on one of those areas. So it indicates that there is less activation on the posterior reading system, left hemisphere of the brain. It also indicates that less temporal partial activation is noted and less occipital partial activation is noted. As you can see the image, it indicates that more activation will be on the left frontal, and right occipital temporal system. It also indicates that age-related differences noted between non-impaired readers and those with dyslexia, especially in the visual word form area, is noted. An important factor is that differences persist into adulthood, affecting development of reading, fluency, and spelling. Many times readers with dyslexia tend to rely on memorization of words. Another thing to consider with individuals with dyslexia is that it's a generic component. It tends to run in families. For the identification of dyslexia, we do have to consider some common risk factors in the different grade levels. Here are some per the Dyslexia Handbook 2010 update. For preschool, kindergarten, and first grade, second and third grade, fourth through sixth grade, middle school and high school. Here are some for post-secondary. As the students go through the educational system, we have to take into consideration the different foundations they receive in each grade level. Now let's talk about the decoding to spelling continuum. Decoding instruction might be known as the technical part of teaching reading. It requires knowledge of language, including phonology and structure of orthography. Knowledge of how children learn language and strategies for teaching a writing system gradually, even as the purpose of reading is kept in focus. This slide demonstrates various decoding components needed through the various school grades. Please note that a well-designed and executed program is able to teach decoding in relation to the student's stage of reading development. This program must include a systematic, explicit connection to meaning. Here we show the screener criteria per the Dyslexia Handbook 2018 update. As you can see, students need to be screened at the end of kindergarten and no later than January 31st in first grade. The areas to consider are phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, sound symbol recognition, letter knowledge, decoding skills, spelling, listening comprehension. We add reading rate and reading accuracy if the child is being assessed in first grade. Now let's go ahead and talk about screeners. Screeners are put into place to determine whether students are at risk of having reading difficulties. These screeners do have limitations. For example, a screener by definition is not comprehensive. It does not provide a diagnosis, and it should not be used to identify the degree of impairment. In addition, a screener should not be used to identify patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Screeners can be either performance-based, which means assessing a skill, or rating-based, which means an individual rates if a child is displaying that behavior. Another item to consider are the error rates of a screener, which is your false positive or false negatives. As we well know, screeners use cutoff points derived by the tool publishers, which are used to group students in categories as at risk or not at risk for dyslexia. It is important to recognize that risk falls on the continuum and that there will always be false positives where students who are screened at risk when they are not, and false negatives when students who are screened not at risk when in reality they are. Consequently, continual progress monitoring and an ongoing review of data is important. We need to remember that all students may be referred for an evaluation at any time, regardless of the results of the screening instrument. Here I've provided some examples of screeners as approved by the Commissioner's List, which are your Text KEA, Dial 4, Start Early Literacy, Ames Web Plus, Dibbles Next, Tejas Lay, TPRI, Lion for Reading, and DESA Mini. Now let's talk about screeners versus an evaluation. Here, I've noted the differences amongst a screener and an evaluation. And we start off with time involved. A screener is usually brief and is administered individually or in a group. However, an evaluation can be lengthy and is usually administered individually. Some of the characteristics of a screener are that it's criterion-based, curriculum-based measures, and it has arbitrary cutoff points. However, for an evaluation, it is norm referenced, standardized based on standard scores, percentiles, grade H-based equivalencies. Screener focuses on a specific skill area. However, for an evaluation, it's more of an intensive assessment of functioning, which entails your cognitive, academic, linguistic, motor, and behavioral. For the 504, cognition is it's not one of those areas that is measured. However, for the evaluation for special education services, cognition needs to be considered. Screeners are usually administered by teachers. Now, for an evaluation, you would need a trained professional in conformance with the instructions provided by the producer of the evaluation materials used. Some of this evaluation materials do require training. You do have to look at the manual to indicate the type of training you need to administer such an assessment. The reason for a screener is to determine students who are at risk and in need of general education remediation. However, in an evaluation, it identifies the strengths and weaknesses with a profile in order to determine the identification of characteristics of dyslexia involving remediation, program placement, and services. Now we look at procedures for evaluation. In accordance to the Dyslexia Handbook 2018 update, it indicates that schools must follow federal and state guidelines. They must develop local procedures that address the needs for their student populations. It also indicates that schools must recommend an evaluation for dyslexia if the student demonstrates poor performance in one or more of the areas of reading and spelling that is unexpected for the student's age or grade. In addition, we have to consider the risk factors addressed earlier on this presentation. Districts and charter schools must establish written procedures for evaluating students for dyslexia. The first step in the evaluation process is gathering data. This integral part of the district or charter school's process must indicate that the student is exhibiting learning difficulties. This slide shows the universal screening and data review for reading risk flowchart, which provides information regarding the decisions schools will make for each student as the school reviews screening results. It is important to remember that at any point in the process, a referral for dyslexia evaluation may be made either under Section 504 if a disability is suspected, or under IDEA if a disability and a corresponding need for special education services are suspected. In this light, we note that there are state and federal laws in place regarding early identification and intervention prior to a formal evaluation. These laws note that a child will need to be screened with reading instruments in the earlier years for the determination of risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties. The school must also implement an intensive reading program that appropriately addresses the students' reading difficulties to enable them to catch up to their peers. These laws also indicate that school must implement a comprehensive literacy instruction featuring age-appropriate, explicit, systematic, and intentional in phonological awareness, phonemic decoding, vocabulary, language structure, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. These laws ensure that all students are given equal access to educational service regardless of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. The Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act, known as IDEA, indicate a student's response to scientific, research-based intervention to be one of the criteria included in IDEA to determine whether a student has a specific learning disability, which includes dyslexia. Procedures for evaluation per the Dyslexia Handbook 2018. While schools must follow federal and state guidelines, they must also develop local procedures that address the needs of their student populations. Schools must recommend evaluations for dyslexia if the student demonstrates poor performance in one or more areas of reading and spelling that is unexpected for the student's age or grade, and if they have some of the characteristics or risk factors discussed previously in this webinar. Districts and charter schools must establish written procedures for evaluating students for dyslexia, and one of the key components is the gathering of data. The gathering of data will assist with targeting the child's learning difficulties. Questions to determine the identification of dyslexia. There are 3 questions we must consider. The first is, does the data show the following characteristics of dyslexia? Which means, does the student demonstrate difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word reading, poor spelling skills, and poor decoding ability? Second question, do these difficulties result from a deficit in the phonological component of language? Please be mindful that average phonological scores alone do not rule out dyslexia. Once again, we have to consider the composite versus the narrows. Question 3, are these difficulties unexpected for the student's age in relation to the student's other cognitive abilities and provisions of effective classroom instruction? Once you've answered this question, the question is, what program are you going to recommend the child to be assessed in? Through the Section 504 program or through the IDEA program, in which an R committee must be considered. A district or charter school must make data-informed decisions that reflect the input of staff and parents for every student on the individual basis every time. The district or charter school should carefully consider all the relevant student data to gauge the level of impact that the student's specific presentation of dyslexia or related disorder will have on the student's ability to access and make progress in the educational setting. A pathway determining the students needs to be evaluated through Section 504 or evaluated under IDEA. The parent and/or guardian must be informed on the differences amongst each program. Pathway indicates the implications if you decide to recommend for a 504 evaluation, or the implications that it entails if you decide to evaluate under IDEA. Here in this slide, we demonstrate the different components necessary for the identification of dyslexia. An evaluation is the process of gathering information to identify the factors contributing to a student's difficulty with learning to read and spell. Assessment personnel have to consider the preponderance of data, which include family history, academic sources, universal measures, and assessment information. When assessing, we begin with the gathering of information from parents and teachers to understand development and the educational opportunities that have been provided. Then tests are given to identify strengths and weaknesses that lead to a diagnosis and a tentative roadmap for intervention. Conclusions and recommendations are developed and reported. In this slide, I have presented to you the various components necessary to assist with the identification of a child with dyslexia. Family history is an important factor to consider when it comes to the identification of dyslexia. As we know, dyslexia is regarded as a neurobiological condition. It is generic in origin. This means that individuals can inherit this condition from a parent. Dyslexia genetics affect the performance of the neurological system, specifically the parts of the brain responsible for learning to read. We also note that dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. Children with language-based learning disabilities express difficulty understanding words. They experience that social language difficulties like pragmatics when interacting with family members or classmates. These difficulties arise when children fail to learn the social implications of word choices and communication behaviors such as eye contact, turn-taking, and topic maintenance. Children may have difficulty following directions, making requests, conveying their ideas in an organized manner, and sometimes appear to have difficulty retrieving a specific word, even if it's common. It is during the student's conference when you can note some risk factors that the student may be experiencing to begin painting a picture of the child's strengths and weaknesses. Academic sources assist in documenting the exposure to appropriate educational opportunities and a student's response to instruction. Here we note universal measures, which includes the various screeners provided in kinder and first grade, to name a few, are key points in determining area of need. These screeners may be used to support your academic area when it comes to report writing. Assessment personnel must also consider performance on language proficiency when considering the identification of dyslexia. Finally, we take into consideration assessment information. It is important that we consider all current evaluations that are in place for the child that is being referred, like the gifted and talented assessments that are in place, or any outside evaluations such as your other health impairment or speech and language assessment. Curriculum-based assessment measures are key in determining where the child is functioning at, and our norm reference tests assist in the strengths and weaknesses for the identification of dyslexia. English learners. Additional considerations need to be taken for English learners. It is noted in the Dyslexia Handbook that a professional involved in assessing these students must have the following training or knowledge. The knowledge should be on the first and second language acquisition theory, knowledge of the written systems of the first language, whether it's transparent, syllabic, semetic, or morphosyllabic. Knowledge of students' literacy skills in the native and second languages, knowledge on how to interpret results from the cross-linguistic perspective, knowledge on how to interpret TELPAS, which is your Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System results, and knowledge on how to interpret results of the student's oral language proficiency in 2 or more languages in relation to the results of the tests measuring academic achievement and cognitive processes, as well as academic data gathered and economic and socioeconomic factors. Another item to consider is the orthographies of the language. For example, if it is opaque or transparent. English is usually opaque. Many early reading and spelling behaviors for English learners resemble those of readers with dyslexia. It may take several years for these similarities to fade even after intensive English as a second language instruction. Examples of common reading and spelling mistakes for English language learners in Spanish is the pronunciation errors due to Spanish phonological influence. English learners may also experience limited knowledge of double consonants or errors due to pronunciation of sounds non-existent in Spanish, like, for example, the letter V for B. For Chinese language learners, we will note poor performance in non-word spelling and reading, like your pseudo words, but not in real word spelling. Also, reading and spelling errors in words with the TH and the SH. For example, sink for think, or sort for short. This slide also denotes the difficulties amongst English and Spanish speakers. As we note here in the slide, for phonological awareness, we may have a less pronounced problem than we would in English. We also note that in decoding, there are fewer irregular words in Spanish than in English. Fluency, often a key indicator. Spelling may show fewer errors than in English, but still more than students that do not have dyslexia. It is also noted that reading comprehension may be a weakness in both English and Spanish languages. The areas for evaluation for the identification of a student with dyslexia are in the academic skills. They will need to be assessed in the areas of letter knowledge and name association sound, reading words in isolation, decoding unfamiliar words accurately, reading fluency, which now we would have to consider the rate, accuracy, and prosody to be assessed for the reading fluency, reading comprehension, and spelling. The cognitive processes to consider are your phonological phonemic awareness, rapid naming of symbols or objects. Those are the required areas to address when taking into consideration and evaluation of the identification of dyslexia. Some possible additional areas to look at is your vocabulary, listening comprehension, verbal expression, written expression, handwriting, memory for letter or symbol sequences known as your orthographic processing, mathematical calculation and or reasoning, phonological memory, verbal, working memory, and processing speed. I would like to review the specific learning disability if the child happens to be referred for an evaluation under IDEA. In this case, IDEA indicates that dyslexia is considered one of a variety of ideological foundations for specific learning disability. It states that a specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic phonological processes which involve in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or to do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disability, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. It does indicate that a specific learning disability does not apply to children who have learning difficulties that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of intellectual disability, of an emotional disturbance, or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. IDEA evaluations requirements for eligibility also indicates specifically designate the following areas for a learning disability, which are in basic reading skills, commonly known where your dyslexia lies, reading fluency skills, and/or reading comprehension. A specific learning disability is comprised of 8 different areas, which is your basic reading skills, reading comprehension, reading fluency, written expression, math calculation, math problem solving, oral expression, and listening comprehension. However, I've denoted here the areas that will affect your dyslexia identification. As noted in the previous slide, it was indicated your basic reading skills. In your basic reading skills, we are looking at the problem areas of reading words in isolation and decoding. For fluency, we are looking at the dyslexia identification under the rate and accuracy of the oral reading as well as your prosody. So for your reading comprehension, also we look at that reading prosody here, and also if it shows an overall reading. But the ones that are dyslexia identifiers are your basic reading skills and your reading fluency. In addition, we take a look at your written expression simply because in the writing assessment components, some of them doesn't tell that spelling component. However, we must take into consideration that spelling will not stand alone. Let's say you evaluate the child and the only area he or she comes out low in is in spelling. Spelling is not the sole indicator for dyslexia. It has to have other components to come into effect. In addition to a child qualifying under a specific learning disability, we have to take into consideration the unexpectedness, which is difficulties are unexpected for the student's age, education level, or cognitive abilities. The intelligence may be superior or in the gifted range. In addition, we take into consideration that he or she has the ability to learn in the absence of print. In diagnosing a child with a specific learning disability, we have to consider the 7 cognitive abilities and determine the strengths and weaknesses from those. Let's go ahead and discuss those, and we start off with comprehension knowledge, known as your crystallized knowledge, which refers to a person's knowledge base that has been accumulated over time. It involves knowledge of one's culture as well as verbal or language-based knowledge that has been developed during general life experiences and formal schooling. Basically, this ability entails more of your culture, your knowledge-based abilities. Your fluid reasoning refers to a type of thinking that an individual may use when faced with a reality of new tasks that cannot be performed automatically. And basically, this ability measures your problem-solving skills or abilities. I also want to express that these abilities have weights, and most of the weights are in your crystallized knowledge and your fluid reasoning. Short-term memory is the ability to hold information in one's mind and then use it within a few seconds. A component of short-term memory is working memory. Working memory relates to an individual's ability to attend to verbally or visually represented information, to process information in memory, and then to formulate a response. Implications to reading are that reading comprehension involves long reading passages, may be affected by skills specifically related to working memory. Basic work reading may be impacted by deficits in short-term memory because it may interfere with acquiring letter and word identification. Your language-based knowledge. Short-term memory is one of those abilities that are used for the association between verbal and visual information. For long-term retrieval or long-term memory, it is the ability to store information, examples like concept, ideas, or names, and retrieving that information through association. The implications in reading are that in associative memory, abilities where in the elementary years, a child associates a letter shape to its name and sound. Retrieval of phonological information from long-term memory refers to how a child remembers pronunciation of letters, word segments, or entire words. So for long-term memory, another indicator here that we have that the manual asks us to measure is the rapid naming ability in your associative memory. Long-term memory also impacts fluency. Now we move on to visual processing. Visual processing is an individual's ability to think about visual patterns and visual stimuli. For example, what is the shortest route from your house to school? Many times visual processing is known to impact higher level math, like your geometry. Auditory processing refers to the ability to perceive, analyze, and synthesize a variety of auditory stimuli, for example, sounds. Auditory processing or phonological awareness processing is very important to reading achievement or reading development. Students who have difficulties with processing auditory stimuli may experience problems with learning grapheme to phoneme correspondence, reading nonsense words, and decoding words due to the inability to segment, analyze, and synthesize speech sounds. So for auditory processing, it's also one of the cognitive abilities that need to be assessed for the identification of dyslexia. This focuses on your phonemic and phonological awareness. Now with processing speed provides a measure of an individual's ability to process simple or routine visual information quickly and effectively, and to quickly perform tasks based on that information. Perceptual speed is important during all school years, particularly in elementary school years. Slow processing speed may impact upon reasoning skills since the basic rapid processing of symbols, for example, letters, is often necessary for fluent reading. So this is another area that may show us a deficiency for dyslexia. I do want to stress that processing speed is known as a domain general deficient. Once again, processing speed impacts the fluency. The cognitive abilities are very important when we start interpreting the data, because this is one of the areas that is very important for us to start viewing those accommodations. For example, deficits in short-term memory start letting us know that students need that repetition when learning new material. For long-term memory, this indicates that the child will benefit from supplemental aids like for science, simply, or social studies, simply because they need that association, that graphic organizer to help them make the association, from what they've learned to hold that information and reference it later for use. Now let's talk about a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. This indicates a student with a learning disability is one who does not achieve adequately for a student's age or meet state-approved grade level standards in oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skill, reading fluency skills, reading comprehension, mathematics calculation, or mathematics problem solving, when provided appropriate instruction, as indicated by performance on multiple measures such as in-class tests, grade average or over time, norm or criterion reference tests, statewide assessments, or a process based the student's response to evidence-based intervention. And 2, exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance, achievement, or both relative to age, grade level standards, or intellectual ability as indicated by significant variance among specific areas of cognitive function, such as working memory and verbal comprehension, or between specific areas of cognitive functioning, or between specific areas of cognitive function and academic achievement. So in other words, there's different models that one can use to diagnose children with a specific learning disability. Here, I am focusing on the pattern of strengths and weaknesses since this is one of the models that can be used. I just want to go ahead and emphasize on where it indicates exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance, achievement, or both intellectual and academics. We, as assessment personnel, must not forget the eligibility criteria of pattern of strengths and weaknesses also entail the pattern of strengths and weaknesses can be presented on cognitive alone or achievement alone. So note, if this happens and you are using the XPAS program, you will be alerted. This is where clinical judgment needs to come into play. Finally, yes, the child will still meet eligibility of a child with a specific learning disability if all the G's in the cognitive abilities are intact, as long as they are showing a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in academics. If a weakness is documented, noted on the basic reading skills, be cautious of the identification of dyslexia characteristics. Remember, assessment personnel determines if an eligibility exists. It is up to the ART committee to make the determination on what program the child will be successful to receive services to meet his or her needs. Here we have a slide by Kara Solinsky, Child Find Student Evaluation Special Education Solution from Region 4, which provided this slide, which she presented on the best practices in identifying dyslexia in the FIE. And we start off with the areas where a child is able to learn when reading is not required, which are vocabulary, listening comprehension, verbal expression, math, which entails your calculation and reasoning. Typically, we must note that the results from these 4 areas are typically higher than your reading and spelling skills. Second, we note the possibility of secondary difficulties, which are your reading comprehension and your written expression. Then finally, we have the cognitive abilities that appear to affect are in phonological memory, auditory working memory, and processing speed. Remember, not one sole source makes the determination for dyslexia identification. Unexpectedness. Definitions often include unexpected for the student's age in relation to the student's other cognitive abilities and provisions of effective classroom instruction. What is meant by unexpectedness? Does the unexpectedness mean the child must show adequate intelligence? What is meant by the ability to learn in the absence of print? Well, in the process of sorting through a variety of data, a practitioner must consider if the deficits indicated lie solely in the primary characteristics of dyslexia, which are in phonological and phonemic awareness and rapid naming. And are these deficits unexpected? In other words, does the examinee demonstrate strengths in areas with the exception of the primary characteristics of dyslexia? When we indicate, does the data show the student has adequate intelligence? This is related to if the examinee demonstrates strengths in the areas assessed that do not involve the reading component, the inability to learn in the absence of print. Are we seeing strengths in the areas of math reasoning, for example, or listening comprehension? We also must note what is meant by provision of effective classroom instruction. In reviewing the data, the practitioner must make sure that the data must show that the student's lack of progress is not due to the student's primary language, irregular attendance, lack of experimental background, a brain injury, disease, surgery of other health factor that would interfere with learning. In the next slide, I will discuss the CS strengths modeled by Sally Shawitz. The CS strengths model of dyslexia shown in this image is a conceptual model of dyslexia. This model considers dyslexia to be an encapsulated or circumscribed weaknesses in decoding surrounded by a range of higher level cognitive strength. In diagnosing dyslexia, the goal is to identify both the strengths and the weaknesses. And in managing dyslexia, the weaknesses is remediated and the strengths are acknowledged and facilitated. This model considers dyslexia to be an encapsulated or circumscribed weaknesses in decoding surrounded by a range of higher level cognitive strengths. In diagnosing dyslexia, the goal is to identify both the strengths and weaknesses, and in managing dyslexia, the weaknesses is remediated and the strengths are acknowledged and facilitated. A critical component of managing dyslexia is to ensure that people who are dyslexic are able to access their strengths. Addressing if a child displays characteristics for dyslexia in your evaluation. Let's say we've already evaluated the child and the child does meet criteria for dyslexia. I put an example here of how you can go ahead and express it within your report to let others who are going to read this report have an indication, oh, he or she did meet the criteria, and this is an indication of how I would know that. And I put here an example excerpt which indicates, for example, John Doe's difficulties in the areas of reading or spelling, if he shows those areas, reflect a pattern of evidence for the primary characteristics of dyslexia, with unexpected low performance for John Doe's age and educational level in some or all of the following. For example, you will note which are the following areas according to your tested areas. He showed a deficiency. Was it in reading word in isolation, decoding unfamiliar words accurately and automatically? Was it in reading fluency for connected text? Or was it in spelling? Please note that the evaluation data collected may also include information on reading comprehension, mathematics, and written expression. Dyslexia often coexists with learning difficulties in these related areas. Another factor to consider when interpreting test results is the student's linguistic background. Once we've screened and made the determination for an evaluation, we do have to consider critical evidence-based components of dyslexia instruction. For students with dyslexia who have been determined eligible for and who are receiving special education services, specially designed instruction must also address the critical evidence-based components. Specially designed instruction differs from standard protocol dyslexia instruction in that it offers a more individualized program specifically designed to meet a student's unique needs within the individualized educational plan. This is in accordance to the Dyslexia Handbook 2018 update. So now let's go ahead and discuss some of these instructional recommendations. Delivery of dyslexia intervention. Instruction designed for students with dyslexia will often take place in a small group setting. Principles of effective intervention for students with dyslexia should include the following, which are simultaneous multisensory, which is teaching is done using all learning pathways in the brain, such as visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile, simultaneously in order to enhance memory and learning. Next, we have systematic and cumulative, which is multisensory language instruction, which requires that the organization of material follow order of the language. Explicit instruction is explained and demonstrated by the teacher one language and print concept at a time, rather than left to discovery through incidental encounters with information. Poor readers do not learn the print represents speech simply from exposure to books or prints. Explicit instruction is an approach that involves direct instruction. The teacher demonstrates the task and provides guided practice with immediate corrective feedback before the student attempts the task independently. Diagnostic teaching and automaticity is where the teacher must be apt at perceptive and individualized teaching. Synthetic instruction presents the parts of language and then teaches how the parts work together to form a whole. Analytic instruction presents the whole and teaches how this can be broken into its component parts. Remember, appropriate intervention is provided. Students with dyslexia make significant gains in reading when effective instruction is highly structured, systematic, and explicit, and it lasts for sufficient duration. Remember, specially designed instruction differs from standard protocol dyslexia instruction in that it offers a more individualized program specifically designed to meet student unique needs. Hence, the critical evidence-based components of dyslexia instruction. Here we have the standard protocol of a dyslexia instruction, which is compiled of phonological awareness, sound symbol association, syllabication, orthography, morphology, syntax, reading comprehension, and reading fluency. Instructional accommodations for students with disabilities per the Dyslexia Handbook 2018 update are listed below. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is comprised of copies of notes, note-taking assistance, additional time on class assignments and tests, reduced shortened assignments, alternative test location that provides a quiet environment and reduces distractions, priority seating assignments, oral reading or directions or written material, word banks, audiobooks, teach-to-speech or speech-to-text, electronic spellers, electronic dictionaries, formula charts, adaptation learning tools, and features to software programs. In addition, we must consider that dyslexia instruction must be taught by an appropriately trained instructor. Teachers need to undergo extensive preparation in the disciplines inherited in literacy, which include the following: language development, phonological and phonemic awareness, alphabetic knowledge, handwriting, decoding, spelling, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, composition, testing and assessment, lesson planning, behavioral management, study skills, history of English language, technology, and meeting the needs of older struggling students. This is indicated by Birch on page 47. Finally, I've included some tests that you can use to measure the following components of dyslexia. For example, here we have letter knowledge, Next, we have word recognition and some of those testing samples. Phonological assessments, RAN assessments, processing speed, memory span or working memory, orthography assessments. I've also included some boundaries to consider for English learners in the different areas of oral language, phonological processing, and academic testing. Here are some of the references used to compile this webinar. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar on the identification of dyslexia. I have provided you my contact information. If you have any additional questions or concerns about this subject, feel free to email me at rnava@esc1.net. Have a wonderful day.